If you're a founder or are someone that's thinking of starting your own business but haven't yet cracked your minimum viable product, also called an MVP, then this video is for you. Because in this video, we speak to someone called Ayush Singhvi. Now, Ayush runs a company called Build, where he's helped non tech founders build tech companies. And Ayush has already helped nearly 50 or so founders build and launch their products with an MVP and gives us a host of insights into how you build an MVP, what is an MVP, how do you make the first version of your product, how do you get your first customers, and how do you actually use feedback to drive revenue. So, if this seems something that's interesting to you, do stay tuned till the very end of the video. And with that said, let's get right into it.
For those people who don't know, probably you can start with what a minimum viable product is and how does one get to it in like the first, let's say 6-7 months, so that they're not part of the 90% of startups that fail.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple of things I want to mention here, right? So a lot of people define MVPs in a bunch of different ways, right? So, but the definition that we use is kind of adjacent to what some people call the MLP, minimum lovable product. And
Hmm.
the idea is that we're building something that's really good enough that they can go and sell it to prospective customers, right? That
Hmm.
founders can go and sell it. And so
Hmm.
it doesn't mean that it's like a clunky product or that there are like bugs or it doesn't work on mobile or whatever. It just means that the functionality is simplified, right? So it's not doing or it's not trying to do too many things. It's focusing on like the core problem and solving that really well, right? So that's how we define MVP.
And I completely sort of agree with what you said, right? That you need to make a minimum, you don't need to make a buggy product, but you need to make a good enough product which essentially solves a problem, right? But the point, Ayush, here is that most startups fail, 90% of the startups fail in the first 6-7 months, 12 months, right?
Yeah.
What's the difference between those 10% that actually get to the 1 year mark and get product market fit, and those 90% that are not able to get product market fit and essentially fail after a year?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the vast majority of startups end up not working, right? And I think the biggest reason is that founders discover that there's no market need for the product that they're building, right? So it's not that you can eliminate that entirely. I don't think, to a very large extent, you do need to kind of do an experiment to figure out if people want to buy your buy whatever it is that you're thinking of selling. But what you can do with kind of MVPs is reduce the amount that you invest in that and reduce the time it takes to kind of go to market and put that product in front of your customers, right? So what we try to do is like have something out in like 4 to 6 weeks most of the time, right? Instead of trying to kind of have a 6 month long development cycle where we're building lots of bells and whistles, we do something like 4 to 6 weeks, something that solves the core problem, and put it out as fast as possible and try to sell it, right? Because that is the best kind of validation that you can get. It's like customers putting their credit cards down and saying like, yeah, I want to buy the product. It's okay if the product is a little buggy. It's okay if it doesn't do everything I needed to do. It's still significant enough that people will like, it still solves a big enough problem for them that people will want to purchase it, right?
Interesting. I think another question that comes to my mind is that uh, you know you said a very important thing, that it's easy, like when essentially we are thinking about solving a product, right? We think about it from multiple directions. For example, if someone today is building a streaming service, right, they'll think about a lot of things. They'll think about, let's say, building a watch list, building I don't know, a recommendation engine. They'll have a lot of ideas, right? So how do you sort of help founders figure out that this is what you need to focus on for this initial product and sort of prioritize that over everything else that's there?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So there are a couple of ways that we approach it, right? Like, so one of the things I mentioned earlier is that we typically tend to work with domain experts, right? So if we're building some kind of streaming platform, for example, the domain expert will probably have an idea of what they're building and why that's differentiated from like the Netflixes and the Amazon Primes of the world, right? So what is their key, like, basically selling point? And then to kind of narrow that down a little bit more, you can run some experiments, right? So what we always encourage founders to do before they even start working with us, especially if we, like, end up interacting with a founder that's like too early, we ask them, like, just go make a landing page and put some copy and run like $100 or $200 worth of ads against it and see, like, how many people are signing up, what are they interested in, have conversations with the people that signed up and ask them, like, why they signed up, what specifically attracted them to this product, and that's going to tell you, like,
Mm.
what people are looking for,
Yeah, yeah,
when you're trying to build it. So it's a combination of like anecdotal evidence from their experience as
yeah.
well as some kind of data from like running these experiments. In and I would say, like, my contrarian opinion here is that we should weigh heavier towards the anecdotal evidence, right?
Oh,
Because
acha.
there are too many factors that affect the data that you're collecting, the keywords that you target, your ad budget. There are lots of variables that you may not know when you're running those experiments. So you should uh, kind of, yeah, put a heavier weight on the kind of experience of this aspiring founder.
We'll dive a little deeper into the validation and development phase, right? So, I think first
Sure.
is something that we want to like talk about is the fact that whenever we are talking to people or founders in the venture backed space, right? They always talk about capturing a big market, right? And uh, I don't know if you're following Shark Tank in India or not, but there is a notion, and that's being built at least in India, that wherever you are getting into, whatever market you're getting into, that needs to be very big for it to make sense for a venture capital, right? For a venture capitalist. So, what are your thoughts about going niche and, let's say, targeting uh, 100 crore market versus like $1 billion of market?
I Okay, so there are a couple of different points to make here, right? So one is VCs are looking for 100x returns, right? So by default, it doesn't make sense for VCs to invest in a market that's too small to give them 100x returns, especially if they're not like very early stage VCs, right? So if you're putting money in a Series A, you're expecting that company to be able to do, like, reach a multi-billion-dollar valuation for you to get that kind of return. Otherwise, like, just VC math, it doesn't make sense,
Hmm.
right? So that's point number one. Um, Point number two is that it's not targeting a niche and targeting a big market are not mutually exclusive, right? So, for example, what typically, uh, what a lot of successful founders do is that they'll target a niche with the technology that they're building, but that technology is then transferable to other, like, areas. For example, one very simple example of this could be by geography, right? So you could be building something for the Philippines, for example, and which is a relatively small market on the global scale, but that same product could be modified and then used to kind of, would work in Singapore and Hong Kong and, the rest of Southeast Asia, if not the world, right? So that kind of that works in both ways. The total addressable market is large enough that it would interest VCs, but your initial go to market strategy is niche enough that you're able to actually kind of dominate that initial market and then spread out from there, right? So a lot of these, if you guys are familiar with like TransferWise, the kind of
I
digital,
don't.
that's I
Haven't heard. Yeah, haven't heard about it. Haven't heard about it.
Uh, it's a digital bank. They're really, really
Acha.
good. And that's been their strategy,
Hmm.
right? For example, a lot of different companies, do that as well. For example,
Mm.
Tinder,
Yeah, of course.
Facebook
Facebook.
as well,
Yeah.
right? The initial target market is niche, but the concept itself was broad enough that it attracted enough VC capital.
Interesting.
The third point I want to make here is that VC funding is not necessarily the only road to success, right? So VCs are looking for very big, like a very big total addressable market. But if you're a bootstrapped founder and you're working in 100 crore market and you're able to dominate that, that's an incredible payoff, right? So you don't necessarily need a massive market to target.
In fact, now that you brought that up, I think there's another question that we were thinking of asking you, which is how many, I mean, in your own experience, how many times have VC funded startups actually done well and versus, let's say, bootstrap startups?
I don't know how to compare the two. I think there's a, you know, everything has its pros and cons. VC funding really allows you to accelerate and to grow very quickly. And sometimes you need it when your competitors have VC funding. You need to do that to be able to just survive in that market, right? Otherwise, they can like
Correct.
just outcompete you. But at the same time, I think one of the cons of VC funding is that it can it creates this like false sense of security, or it creates a sense that like you can experiment and be a little bit more financially careless, which is not a great approach, and which generally doesn't happen with bootstrap founders, right? Because they're much more financially conservative with what they're doing, right? So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't think VC funding is necessarily bad, but I just think that it's not necessarily like the only way to build a successful business.
Yeah. I think another way to sort of look at VC funding is that a typical venture capital fund ka life is 8 years, right? So they need to give the fund back plus whatever XIRR in 8 years, right?
Exactly.
So as a bootstrap founder, you have the luxury or the disadvantage of growing at 10% or maybe 15% if you're in a high growth market for the next 20 years. So you take probably 20-30 years to get to whatever scale profitably, or you can essentially get to it faster in like 8 years and then sort of figure out, and then via an IPO route or via I don't know, an acquisition, you can essentially get that return and get that scale as well. So I think it is, it really depends on what target market are you trying to capture. Things like Zomato, things like Swiggy, things like Uber won't work without venture capital funding, right? Going back to validation, right? So I think another interesting point that we want to talk about is, I'm sure you've read Paul Graham's essay 0 to 1, right? So where he talks about doing things that don't scale, right? How relevant do you think that is in today's scenario? Is it still relevant for founders today?
100%. I think that is, if I could like pick out one factor that determines whether or not a business would work out, it's really how willing the founder is to get their hands dirty and do, I mean, you can say get their hands dirty, you could say do things that don't scale, you could say get out of the building and talk to customers. They all ultimately mean the same thing, right? Like how willing is the founder to go and like really put themselves in the customer's shoe and figure out what's working and what's not working and what problem or how the product that they're building is solving the problem they have, right? And if they're able to do that for the first 100 customers, I think that's a very, very good indicator of like the future of the company.
And I think that's a
Interesting.
similar mentality we've at least been pursuing with Perspectify, because
Yeah.
a very unconventional approach. I mean, most of the people that I've known who've grown podcasts always tell me that you guys should go out and do shorts and put out a lot of clips and see if you can get growth from there. But instead, what we've been doing is actually going to every single friend, family, network member and actually pitching a podcast and sort of getting feedback and trying to grow through that. So we've seen some success in that at least, and I feel like that's a strategy that does work at least in the initial phase. I think just a
Yeah.
small last question on this whole idea validation segment that we probably missed out. And again, I speak about Perspectify again because that's the most immediate idea I can think about. But let's say, even in case of our own podcast, we actually didn't have any market research going into the podcast, right? We probably just realized that, you know what, this might be a market where people want to know about marketing, product, MVPs, all these kind of things, and we find this interesting, and that's why we want to talk about it, right? That's why we went out and built this sort of podcast. But getting perspective from you on this, at what I mean, initially when you're sort of building something out, firstly, what kind of market research do you think is important to sort of understand whether this makes sense or not? And also, at what point do you decide a niche? Because, for example, when we started out, we thought we were going to marketing product, and I don't know if that's still a credible idea. Like, we're still testing out things, but that's something that we're still seeing if it works or not. So, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, businesses like people are evolving, right? And they're constantly evolving. So I don't think the idea of like sticking to a niche forever necessarily makes sense. I think the way to approach this, and this is what we did at Build as well, right? Initially, we started as like a fractional CTO kind of business, and then like it turned into CTO as a service, and then eventually it kind of we tried different things, and like what ended up happening is that when you put a certain message out into the world, you'll get some kind of resonance, right? And what we discovered is like, hey, build an MVP, go to market, and do this in like less than 2 months for less than 15K. That kind of resonated well with a lot of people, right? And that's so we move to that, right? And now I mean, it doesn't mean that you stop experimenting, you stop trying different things, but that what that gives you is your baseline, and then you try out a couple of other experiments and see if that changes your baseline, if you get more resonance there, or if it makes more sense for your business model. So I don't think there's like any point where you just kind of decide like this is what I'm going to do. It's always evolving, it's always changing.
And I think you already said that you probably need to have some clear experience to probably start something and see how it goes, right? That's the first thing you said.
So let me clarify that a little bit, right? There's a concept called earned secrets. I don't know if
Hmm.
you guys are familiar with it.
No, no idea.
And the idea behind earned secrets is that this is something that is counterintuitive, but it's very well known to the
Hmm.
people who've done the work, right?
Hmm.
So if you're in a particular industry, it might not be obvious to the people outside the industry, but if you've spent 3 years in that business,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know
yeah.
certain things about that industry.
Exactly.
These are the
Yeah.
stuff that you've
Yeah.
earned,
Agreed.
Right?
Yeah.
And so
that these are the tricks of the trade.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So though that's what I mean by like experience, right? You need to have
yeah,
faced a problem,
Hmm.
you need to have encountered something and like earned those secrets, right? So
Hmm. Hmm.
that's
Hmm.
what I mean by domain expert, right? Like a
Hmm.
domain expert doesn't necessarily have to spend 10 years in a particular industry. That person just needs to have experience trying to solve a problem
Hmm.
that they couldn't solve, or like dealing with the problem and having the willingness to kind
Yeah.
of do something about it.
hmm. And I think this brings us to the sort of like to the second segment of the podcast again, talking about distribution, because I think you've also helped people set out their initial distribution networks. How do you approach distribution? Like, how do you think about people starting out? What are the first one, two, three channels that people probably start with?
It depends on the business, right? Like if it's B2B, I would say probably email marketing is a very, very strong way to kind of get your first kind of interest in the product. If it's consumer, then there are lots of options, from kind of ads to social media, influencer marketing, or even social media ads. I mean, it really, really depends on what the product is and who your target is, right? So you have to go where your customers are. Um, it's hard to generalize.
How did you get your initial customers for Build?
Combination of networking and email.
Acha.
networking with, I was in New York for a while, so I knew a lot of people in the entrepreneurial space in New York,
Hmm.
and had some friends that were either like part of some VC network or running an accelerator
Hmm.
or stuff like that, and they
Mm-hmm.
referred founders to us.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And then email marketing also
I think email
contributed
marketing
to
really
this time. Correct.
works
Makes
because for some
sense.
reason I feel like my mailbox is filled with spam these days. So I personally have not had much experience.
Yeah, that's why personalization helps, and also kind of yeah, personalization for sure. I think, or rather, to an extent, it helps. But I think like really just talking about the
Hmm.
problem that you solve for their customer, right? Like what pain point do you get rid of?
Hmm.
Um, I do think there's value in email marketing. It has worked for us to a very large extent.
Acha.
It's worked for many of the founders we
Hmm.
work with as well.
Makes sense.
Interesting.
And I think sort of we have reached, let's say, at this point, we've talked about again multiple things. We've talked about building a basic MVP, having a niche, some amount of distribution. And that also begs the question once you have all the pieces of this puzzle sort of fit in, now you probably want to go out and continue this process and also keep taking customer feedback and probably improving from here on out, right? Our next question is probably like, let's say when you're doing your initial sets of consumer feedback, some sort of research to just continuously improve your business, how do you go about that, right? Because a lot of market research can be very broad and it can give you no evidential ideas that actually contribute to anything, right? So how do you go about that initial customer feedback surveys to make sure that it's not biased inherently?
I would say like don't do surveys, right? I don't have conversations with them, do interviews, and like there are lots of different things, right? Like Steve Jobs famously would like hang around an Apple store and see how people were using the product, right? And that there's value in that for sure. Like just having people kind of use it while you just sit there and take notes, having more meaningful conversations with them about kind of what they're trying to accomplish and what they're doing and etc. Surveys, I think, are very limiting. And I think they might make sense when you're at a much larger scale, but I don't think it makes sense for like early stage companies.
And another question. Earlier in the podcast, you said that initially don't look at data as much, right? Which is a very counterintuitive thing, to be very honest, right? And
Yeah.
go with your gut slash um, uh, the qualitative side of data, right? Which is more about talking to users.
Mm.
Can you talk a bit more about
Yeah.
can you talk about it a bit more? Because I think that's very counterintuitive. Because if someone's, let's say, coming from any medium sized company, right? They would be told to look at just data and make their decisions based on data and with a little bit of qualitative
Mm.
feedback, right? But I think the
Yeah.
ball game in 0 to 1 is very different.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the difference is that generally, like medium-sized companies have found um, to a very large extent, like the niche that they want to focus on. They've either found product market fit or are very close to product market
Hmm.
fit,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
and so it makes sense to kind of rely much more heavily on data to do like a lot of incremental improvements
Hmm.
to the product. But when you're early stage, basically everything is an assumption.
Hmm.
And I don't think that, like, you know, running some basic experiments with copy and language should, like, is good enough to determine the trajectory of, like, kind of what you do, right? So if you have experience of, like, whatever a certain amount of time and you faced a problem and you're confident that like, hey, this problem it's a problem
Hmm.
for me, it's a problem for the people I know who are in this industry.
Hmm.
Even if you run an ad and nobody clicks on it, there's still like there's a lot of value in your experience,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so that's why you can't rely too much on the data because there are too many
Mm.
factors that affect it, that you may not even be aware of when you're running those experiments, right? Your budget, ad budget might be too low, your keywords might be different. Like I'll give you an experiment of what we did. We ran ads for process automation a couple of years ago, where the idea was like, we would help a business kind of automate internal processes and make their workflow smoother so their team members could focus more on higher impact activities. Sounds great. Sounds like that's something that people want. And I was convinced that this is something that people want. But that ad did really badly. We got very little leads. Even marketing campaigns with those terms did not work. Turns out later, I figured out that people were calling it workflow automation. And process automation meant like kind of automating the manufacturing process with, hardware. So if I had taken like that data and just relied on that independent, like exclusively, then that entire like branch of the
That's
business
so
wouldn't
true.
exist.
And I
Interesting.
think a
Interesting.
very interesting question that's popping in my head right now. So one is you obviously mentioned product market fit also, and you're also saying that what initially don't look at data excessively obviously, right? So I mean, considering that you don't probably look at a lot of these metrics, how do people know for a fact that they've hit product market fit, right? Like when do they
Yeah.
decide
Yeah.
that, oh, what, my product is finally working, right? Because I'm essentially not looking at a lot of data. I don't want to get trapped up into data, but at the same time, I have to know for sure that this is scaling well, right?
Are you guys familiar with like the flywheel effect?
Not.
No. Okay. Uh, Basically, it's like the engine of your business, right? Like you're getting customers. Customers are doing something that is having an impact in the market, and other people are either hearing about it, or your customers are like referring you to other people, and that like is kind of turning the engine of your business, right? And when that happens independently of like external stimuli, like without putting in a lot of ad money, without running like very expensive campaigns and stuff, when that starts to happen organically and automatically, that's what I consider product market fit. So your business is growing without you putting in effort.
I think that's about it. I think we have covered very interesting things in this episode. Thank you so much, Ayush, for doing it for the second time. And yeah, see you in the next one.